Most people believe empires are built by armies. History seems to confirm it. Legions march, battles are won, territory expands. But that is only the surface, because Rome did not rise on steel alone. It rose on something far quieter and far more fragile. Grain, not gold, not weapons, not power in the way we usually imagine it. Just food, simple, essential, easy to overlook. Yet behind every triumph of emperors, behind every marching legion, there was a hidden system working in silence, a system that fed over 1 million people in a single city, a system that stretched across seas, across provinces, across fragile supply lines. And if that system failed, even for a short time, Rome did not weaken. It panicked, because hunger does not wait, and an empire that cannot feed its people cannot hold its power. So beneath the glory of Rome, there was something else, a network few people ever saw, a mechanism that could sustain the empire or quietly bring it to its knees. But how did something as simple as grain become the foundation of one of the greatest empires in history? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning. To the average Roman citizen, food simply appeared. Ships arrived at the ports. Markets filled with grain. Bread was handed out in the streets. It felt natural, routine, almost guaranteed. But that sense of stability was an illusion, because behind it all was a tightly controlled system. Part trade, part politics, part silent power struggle. Grain did not just move freely across the empire. It was tracked, managed, protected. Every shipment mattered, because Rome was not just a city. It was a massive population concentrated in one place. Hundreds of thousands of people who depended on a constant flow of food. And that created a dangerous reality. Whoever controlled the grain controlled the city, not through force, not through laws, but through something far more immediate, survival. Because when food is stable, people stay calm. But when food disappears, even for a moment, order breaks. Riots begin, loyalty fades, power shifts. In Rome, grain was not just an economic resource. It was leverage. And once leaders understood this, they didn't just protect the grain supply. They built an entire system around it. But this system didn't appear overnight. It was shaped by crisis, pressure, and necessity. And to see how it all began, we have to go further back. As Rome expanded beyond Italy, it gained more than land. It gained responsibility, new provinces, new people, new wealth, but also new dependencies. At first, Rome could feed itself. The surrounding lands of Italy were enough. Local farms, local supply, local control. But as the empire grew, so did its capital. The city of Rome began to swell. Hundreds of thousands turned into over 1 million, a massive population, all concentrated in one place. And that changed everything, because the land around Rome could no longer keep up. The demand for food outpaced what Italy alone could produce. So Rome made a shift. It stopped feeding itself and started relying on others. Grain began to flow in from distant provinces, from Sicily, from North Africa, from Egypt, regions with fertile land and strong harvests. But this created a new kind of problem, distance, because now food had to travel across the Mediterranean, through unpredictable weather, through dangerous waters, across long, fragile supply lines. A storm could delay ships. A poor harvest could reduce supply. A disruption in one region could ripple across the entire system. And suddenly, Rome's survival depended on things it could not fully control. What once was simple became complex. What once was stable became fragile. And that fragility created pressure. Because when an entire city depends on distant grain, someone has to manage the risk. And that's where the real system begins to take shape. This created a dangerous imbalance. Rome had grown too large to feed itself, but too dependent to survive disruption. The entire city now relied on a constant flow of grain. Day after day, ship after ship, no interruptions. And that meant one thing. If the grain stopped, even briefly, everything else would start to break. At first, it would look small. Empty stalls in the markets, longer lines for bread, But in a city like Rome, small shortages did not stay small. Because food is immediate, people can ignore politics. They can tolerate taxes, but they cannot ignore hunger. So panic would begin to spread. Crowds would gather. Rumors would move faster than facts. Fear would turn into anger. And then riots. Not organized, not controlled. Just raw reaction from a population that felt its survival slipping. And in that moment, power became fragile. Because an emperor could command armies, but he could not command an empty stomach. Food shortages didn't just threaten comfort. They threatened order itself. Political stability started to crack. Loyalty became uncertain. Control began to slip. And that forced Rome to confront a hard truth. Feeding the population was not just a necessity. It was a matter of power. So the question was no longer how to grow more grain. The question became something else. So Rome adapted. It did not leave its survival to chance. It did not rely on open markets alone. Instead, it took control. Grain was no longer just something to trade. It became something to manage. Step by step, Rome began to build a system around it. Policies were introduced. Prices were influenced. Supply was monitored. What once moved freely was now guided. The state began to step in, not always loudly, not always visibly, but consistently, because the goal was not just supply. The goal was stability. Grain was treated differently from other goods. It was subsidized, distributed, sometimes even given away, not as generosity, but as strategy, because a well-fed population is predictable. A hungry one is not, and Rome understood this clearly. So grain became more than a commodity. It became infrastructure, a system designed to hold the city together, to reduce panic, to prevent unrest before it even began. From the outside, it still looked simple. Ships arrived, markets filled, bread was baked, but underneath everything had changed. Now, grain was part of governance itself, and once Rome started managing food like this, the system didn't stay small. It expanded, and that expansion would reshape the empire in ways few could see at the time. How do you control it? And that's where the system evolves into something far more deliberate. Then came Egypt, not just another province, but the empire's lifeline. Along the Nile, something unique existed: predictable floods, rich soil, massive harvests. Year after year, Egypt produced grain at a scale few regions could match. Exactly what Rome needed, because while other provinces were important, Egypt was essential. Its grain did not just support the system, it stabilized it. Ship after ship would leave the ports of Alexandria, cross the Mediterranean, and arrive in Rome loaded with the food that kept the city alive. And this changed the balance of power, because controlling Egypt was not like controlling other territories. It was different, strategic, sensitive, dangerous. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled a large part of Rome's food supply, and that meant something deeper. They controlled stability, because if those shipments slowed or stopped, the effects would be immediate. Shortages, panic, pressure on leadership. So Rome treated Egypt carefully. It was not just governed, it was guarded. Emperors placed it under direct control. Access was restricted. Authority was tightly held. Because losing Egypt was not just losing land, it was risking the entire system. And this revealed something important. The grain network was no longer just economic, it was geopolitical. And once one region became this critical, Rome had to expand the system even further to protect itself, because relying on a single lifeline was a risk of its own. Over time, the system grew, not suddenly, but steadily, layer by layer. What began as a response to risk turned into a complex network. Grain was no longer just moved, it was organized. Storage facilities were built across key in the empire, massive granaries that could hold reserves for months, buffers against uncertainty. Shipping routes became more defined, ports were upgraded, schedules were coordinated. The movement of grain started to follow a rhythm, timed, planned, watched, and alongside all of this, administration expanded. Officials tracked supply, managed distribution, monitored prices and shortages. What looked simple from the outside was anything but, because behind every loaf of bread in Rome, there was a chain, fields in Egypt, ships crossing the sea, workers unloading cargo, officials directing flow, a system within a system. And over time, this mechanism began to do more than just feed people. It began to shape behavior. The timing of distributions influenced daily life. The presence of grain influenced public mood. The system quietly dictated the rhythm of the city itself. Invisible but constant. And that is when the system reached its full form, because it was no longer reacting to problems. It was controlling outcomes. And once a system reaches that level, its influence doesn't stay in the past. It echoes forward. Today, the systems look different. They are larger, faster, global. Ships have become cargo fleets. Markets have become digital. Supply chains stretch across continents in ways Rome could never imagine. But the principle has not changed, because modern economies still depend on invisible networks. Food, energy, goods, all moving constantly, often unnoticed. From the outside, everything feels stable. Stores are stocked. Services run smoothly. Life continues without interruption, just like in Rome. But beneath that surface, there is coordination, logistics systems, global trade routes, carefully managed flows of supply. And when those systems are disrupted, the illusion breaks. Shelves empty, prices rise, uncertainty spreads, not because resources disappear overnight, but because the system that moves them falters. And that reveals something important. The true power in any system is not always what people see. It is what keeps everything running, quietly, consistently, behind the scenes, just like grain in ancient Rome. And once you see that, you start to understand the deeper pattern, because control is not always visible. It does not always wear a crown. It does not always command an army. Sometimes it operates in silence, hidden inside systems, built into infrastructure, embedded in the flow of everyday life. Because real control is not just about force. It is about access, who gets resources, who waits, who decides the timing. In Rome, it was grain, who received it when it arrived, how it was distributed. And that power did not need to announce itself. It simply worked. Because when you can shape supply, you can shape behavior. People adjust without realizing it. They depend without questioning it. They follow patterns that feel natural, but are carefully maintained. That is the subtlety of it. Control becomes invisible, not because it is weak, but because it is built into the system itself. And once it reaches that level, it becomes harder to challenge, because you are no longer confronting a person. You are confronting a structure, a system that decides outcomes quietly, long before anyone notices. And that leads to one final realization. The true strength of an empire is not just in what it controls, but in how quietly it controls it. The Roman Empire did not just manage land. It did not just rule over people. It managed flow, the movement of grain, the timing of supply, the balance between stability and chaos. And in doing so, it revealed something deeper, because power is not only about what you can command. It is about what others depend on. Rome understood this. It built a system that fed millions, calmed unrest, and held the empire together without constant force, not through noise, but through control of something simple, grain. And that idea did not disappear with Rome. It evolved, because even today, the same principle remains. The strongest systems are often the least visible. The most powerful forces are the ones people rarely question. Because when something always works, no one stops to ask why. And that is where real power lives. Not in what people see, but in what they rely on every single day. If you want to understand how power really works, you have to look beneath the surface. Because what sustained Rome was not just force. It was systems. Hidden, structured, constant. And those systems did not disappear. They evolved. They became larger, more complex, more difficult to see. But they are still here, shaping economies, guiding decisions, influencing everyday life in ways most people never notice. This is only the beginning. Because once you start seeing these invisible structures, you cannot unsee them. So if you want to go deeper into the systems that quietly control the world, past and present, subscribe and step inside the story most people never realize they're already part of.